Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Gerard. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I'll be facilitating tonight's event on the Korean War, which was organized by the International Committee of DSA. This year marks 70 years since the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement in July 1953, which, although saw an end to the military fighting, it left the Korean War officially unended still to this day, with the Korean Peninsula divided and US sanctions against the North continuing. We are hosting this event today on June 24th in the US, June 25th in Korea, which is also often inaccurately considered as the start of the Korean War in 1950. This war is one of many in the long history of US endless wars that have killed millions of people since the decades after World War II, and also one of the most destructive, where some 5 million people have been killed. The US refers to this as the Forgotten War in an attempt to erase the scale and culpability it played in this disastrous conflict, leaving this history and its ongoing impacts unreckoned with in the US. To address the many historical distortions that have been created by the US over the past decades around the causes of the war and its impacts, we are joined by a panel of guest speakers consisting of longtime anti-war organizers and experts who will each discuss the important aspects of the Korean War and what the possible path toward peace can be. Noah Kulwin, co-host of the Blowback podcast, will give an intro on their work on the Korean War. Ju-Hyun Park from Nodutdol will talk on the history and causes of the war. Sheen Kim from YDSA and ISC will talk about the scale of the impacts of the war. Jeong-eun Hwang from the International Strategy Center in South Korea will discuss the contemporary political situation in the South. And Cathi Choi from Women Cross DMZ and Korea Peace Now will talk about US policy and how the war could end. On DSA side, we have been organizing in the International Committee over the past years with local activists in the Asia Pacific to combat the dangers posed by rising US-driven militarism. Korea, like Japan, is a central node for the US in its strategy of reinforcing its hegemony in the region. Even after 7 decades since the armistice was signed, the US military occupation continues with some 80 military sites and 30,000 troops in Korea, and sanctions against the North have only intensified over the past decades to the detriment of civilians and normalization efforts for peace. DSA has been coordinating with organizers in the US and comrades in Korea to support anti-war organizing initiatives and host event discussions like this to build solidarity, including recently an international conference for peace in Northeast Asia organized by the International Strategy Center, one of the orgs here tonight, which brought together elected members of parliament from the Justice Party in South Korea and organizers from Korea, Japan, Okinawa, the US, and UK to speak against a brewing new Cold War against China. Today, we face an atmosphere of growing warmongering rhetoric, large-scale military exercises between the US, Japan, and Korea alliance, increased military spending, upgraded weapon systems, and now even US nuclear submarines deployed to Korea. This puts the region and the world at risk, and it's crucial that anti-war organizers everywhere work to combat the serious dangers posed by this and organize toward peace in the interest of working class people. Today's event will be recorded, and we will follow up afterwards to the RSVPs with it and all the info and action items. Everyone can find all of this at dsaic.org/Korea, which we will update later with the recording. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A and the panelists can answer there directly or at the end if there's time. And I'm going to hand it over now to Noah Kulwin for an introduction before the presentation. Noah is a journalist and the co-host of the Blowback podcast, which is a really great US history and foreign policy podcast, with their most recent season 3 last year being an in-depth historical look on the Korean War. He is also a contributing editor at Jewish Currents and a writer for numerous national publications. Noah, you can take it away.
Hello, Gerard. Thank you for putting this together. Thank you to everybody else who's here. And thank you to everybody watching and listening. I'm going to speak briefly, and I'd like to, I think everybody else here has a lot more to say about what's happening currently. And I wanted to instead use my time to take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about the historical parallels between the Korean War 70 years ago and the present moment. And just to note that, in spite of how often the Korean War is referred to as the forgotten war, or that the conflict is somehow mysterious and far behind, that actually the Korean War 70 years later has a really a quite meaningful amount of resonance, and in fact is still going on in policy, is still referenced in policy discussions today. So the first thing I wanted to mention on that note was that current conflict in Ukraine, with the most recent developments with Wagner aside, the Korean War has been referenced increasingly recently as it relates to what may end up happening in the state of Ukraine. And there's been an enormous amount of anxiety about whether or not there will be, an Al Jazeera and like pressed across the political spectrum and in multiple languages refer to the possibility that Korea may have that Ukraine may install a DMZ across the middle of Ukraine, separating the Donbass and the east from the west. And they call this a Korea scenario. And what I find particularly kind of jarring about it is that it's presented as some kind of solution, that the installation of a DMZ, of some kind of demilitarized zone separating the east from the west of Ukraine, would in fact, tamp down the violence and tamp down the conflict. When, as I think many people familiar with the details of the Korean conflict know, that's not the role of the DMZ. And it's also not the effect of the DMZ, which is a continuation, a very violent process, and is the installation, in effect, of a permanent war zone in between the two countries, a constant, heavily militarized reminder that, in fact, yes, there are two sides very much still at war, and were it not for this thin line keeping them, they would be in an active conflict. And the second thing I also wanted to mention was the sort of more broad and general political and economic in these two comparisons. Something that's sort of been, I wouldn't say lost to history, but is definitely not well understood, is that immediately after World War II, America and much of the world was racked by what we today call inflation. There was a cascades of rising price. Cascade goes down. There were eruptions of rising prices all over the Western, we call the Western world now. And the Marshall Plan and the development aid for the reconstruction of Europe is sort of what's popularly remembered. But the year 1946 was a strike wave, and there's the Writers Guild currently on strike now. The UAW, with a new radical leadership, has been making lots of noise, and the Teamsters are also, talking quite seriously about how they're organizing, at the moment. And there is I think, the Biden administration, and we noted this in Blowback, has called attention to the inflationary period of the late 1940s as being something similar to today. And part of what the Korean War was, at least from the American perspective, it was an anti-inflation measure. They believed that by fighting the Korean War and by using the federal infrastructure that was summoned to fight the Korean War, that they did successfully manage, they were able to institute price controls. And while I don't believe that we're going to see a new office of or price stabilization bureau or a wage stabilization bureau like we did 70 or 80 years ago, I do think that part of what the Korean War is a really helpful illustration of is the ways in which military conflicts can be the channel through which policymakers actually attempt to deal with some of the bigger problems of our time, most notably inflation and the rising cost of living that everybody's facing. And I guess lastly, the sort of thing that's been most interesting in the last week, as all eyes have been paying attention to Ukraine and Russia, is that the White House has not forgotten about Korea. And the White House has not forgotten about the Korean Peninsula. This past week marked the third time that Biden renewed the state of national emergency that was first declared in 2008 as it relates to nuclear matters. And Jake Sullivan is actually currently on a tour in Asia, meeting in Tokyo with officials from various specific governments, including South Korea, which is all to say that, as the next few years develop, and as the American policy towards, China begins to take shape, there is a lot of talk about decoupling. There is a lot of talk about the new structure of conflict between two new, as we were told, repeatedly, two new aspiring hegemons. Obviously, these narratives are excessively simplified and are not particularly fair to the Chinese or many of the other countries that we've brutalized over the years. But I do think that what it shows is that this part of the world is very, very, very much front of mind for American officials, even if they're not talking about it. And that as American policy continues to cohere, and increasingly South Korea and the South Korean government is relied upon, no matter how reactionary it gets, or no matter how no matter how the reactionary the American leadership gets, there is going to be a real need for these governments to get, fall in line, whether it's to provide America's strategic, the military, various militaries with the goods and whether chips or material and ammunition and everything they need, or it's going to be, continuing, I guess. And this is sort of to me, what is the last thing, the real last note I'd like to end on is just that these are not relationships that are sort of built or solidified in one fell swoop, but rather they take years and lots of time to develop into functioning military alliances. And in the case of South Korea and the US, it has been a functioning military alliance for many decades. In fact, it's the model for how many people would like to see their countries, develop if they are to seek a patron relationship with the US. And I guess it's, as much as these things don't happen overnight, they're built over many years. And I think it's the terrific work of many of the people on this panel, to whom I'm looking forward to hearing from, who are drawing attention to the ways in which the way in which, a policy like this is constructed over many years. Because although the Korean War, ended but didn't end 70 years ago, it would be a damn shame if it had to continue for another 70. And oh yeah, is there a book to recommend is a question that's coming in. And I did actually make a note of this before this panel started because I wanted to make a recommendation. I.F. Stone's Hidden History of the Korean War was recently reissued by the Monthly Review, but you can also find older and different versions for cheap online. And quite truthfully, that was the Bible that Brennan and I referenced in making season 3, and I highly, highly recommend it for anybody. It's just a marvelous book, and it's called The Hidden History of the Korean War by I.F. Stone. Highly recommend it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Noah. And thank you for your work as well. If people haven't listened to the podcast, you definitely check out the Korean War season. Part of the reason why we decided to do this event, exactly because of how great that season was. So next, we're going to move into the presentations. For our first panelist, Ju-Hyun Park is a member of Nodutdol, an anti-imperialist and national liberation-focused organization of Koreans in the diaspora and comrades. By day, Ju-Hyun is also the engagement editor at The Real News. They will talk on some of the history and causes of the Korean War and the U.S. aims for conflict with the DPRK and China. You can take it away.
Thank you so much, Gerard. And before I begin, I want to also extend our really heartfelt thanks on behalf of the organization to the DSA International Committee, to the Blowback podcast for, being here, and also for, putting out such an excellent season. And of course, to all our fellow panelists who are here today from other excellent organizations, which I'm sure that everyone will get to hear more about, but which you are strongly encouraged as a listener to investigate and find ways to support. As Gerard mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the historical origins of the Korean War, particularly with an eye towards understanding U.S. aims in Asia against the DPRK and China. Now, before I begin, I do want to make a note about why it is that this is so important. At Nodutdol, we are not just concerned with knowing the past for intellectual reasons or bearing witness to the present as a kind of ethical duty. Our primary concern is the struggle for the future, and that's reflected in our name, Nodutdol, which means stepping stones in Korean. Our study of the past is concerned with constructing a path into the future. And that brings us to the relevance of this history towards the future of Korea, because in the case of the Korean War, the past is not past. It is an ongoing war that remains a problem to be solved in order to understand what a liberated future might mean and how we might arrive there. And given the particular circumstances of the Korean War, the rigorous study of history is important because what most of us know about this war is more myth than fact. Now, what are these myths? Let's review the dominant narrative of the Korean War, which most of you are probably quite familiar with. The story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there were two Koreas. The Korea in the south was free, but the Korea in the north was a Soviet puppet. One day, North Korea invaded South Korea to spread communism, requiring the United States to intervene under the banner of the United Nations. The US saved democracy in Korea and to this day safeguards the South from a belligerent actor in the North. Now, even if we take this dominant narrative on its own terms, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. Why was Korea, a nation united under a single polity for more than 1,000 years, suddenly divided after World War II, despite the fact that Korea was not an aggressor in the war, unlike Germany, which was the only other country to meet this fate? If North Korea did invade South Korea under the instructions of the Soviets, why did the Soviets themselves not participate in this war, or for that matter, launch its own offensives elsewhere? And if the United States intervened in Korea to protect democracy, how can it be that South Koreans themselves do not consider democratization to have occurred until the late 80s or even the early 90s, more than a generation after the armistice in 1953? Answering these questions requires us to correct the historical narrative. The Korean War has been primarily classified as a Cold War conflict, and that has distorted our perception of the war's causes, which is also due in no small part because the US has exaggerated the role of the Soviet Union. Now, the Korean War was shaped by the external environment, but it also arose from circumstances that were internal to Korea at the time. Fundamentally, this war was a struggle for the future between opposing class forces in Korea, following 35 years of brutal and direct Japanese colonial rule. Prior to colonization, Korea was a feudal society where the majority of people were peasants whose labor produced the country's wealth. And then there was a minority of landlords, also known as yangban, who seized that wealth for themselves. During colonialism, Japan relied upon this landlord class to exploit Korea as an agricultural colony. The peasantry had to pay taxes and rent with the crops that they planted and harvested, mainly rice. Then Japanese companies sold that rice for a profit, none of which went to the peasants who actually produced it. When the peasants were eventually pushed off their land by debt and hunger, Japanese capitalists exploited them once again as workers. These class distinctions were essential to maintaining Japanese rule over Korea. Japan needed Korean peasants to grow food. They needed Korean workers to labor for cheap in factories. And eventually, they needed Koreans as draft fighters in its military, and particularly women to make up the bulk of those who were conscripted into a system of military sexual slavery known today as the comfort women system. Japan couldn't force the masses of Korean peasants and workers to do these things without Korean landlords, Korean police willing to collaborate with them. Resistance to colonialism therefore arose from class exploitation, and what that meant was that the peasants and the workers were the ones who formed the real core of the national liberation movement in the colonial era. And many of these people were influenced by Korean communists who were seeking to make socialist revolution. The origins of the Korean War are therefore in the class distinctions that arose during Japanese colonialism. By 1945, a decades-long struggle had already taken place to liberate Korea from imperialism. But once Japan was defeated in World War II, the struggle had to continue because Japan may have been defeated, but neither imperialism as a world system nor the Korean collaborators in league with imperialism were defeated. This is when the politics of the Cold War enters the picture. The decision to divide Korea was made solely by the United States. Just days after bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, US military officials drew a line across Korea and declared two occupation zones, one Soviet, one American. The reason they needed to declare a Soviet zone was because the Soviets were already in Korea. What dividing Korea accomplished was to stop the Soviet advance and keep a toehold in Asia for the United States. After the US announced its decision, the Soviets acquiesced and observed the 38th parallel as a dividing line in Korea. Meanwhile, among Korean people themselves, most people were just not aware of the events transpiring in Washington. After all, no decision makers in the Pentagon had bothered to ask a single Korean person. And in the meantime, Koreans were already organizing for our own independence, from the smallest villages to the greatest cities. People's committees were formed to maintain order in communities, to take back stolen land from Japanese imperialists and their collaborators, and to welcome back revolutionaries who were freed from prison or returned from exile. Not all Korean people were necessarily united in ideology, but because the vast majority of the society was of a peasant background, there was a broad unity of material interests against the remnants of colonialism and in favor of total independence. On September 6, 1945, just a few weeks after Japan's surrender, these people's committees were ready to declare the formation of an independent Korean People's Republic. Enter the United States. The US military arrived in Korea just days after the People's Republic was proclaimed. The US military did not recognize the authority of the People's Committees, and they bristled at the agenda to seize private property and return it to the masses of working people. Because what does that sound like? It sounds like communism. Instead, the US military declared itself the government of Southern Korea, and within months, US troops were waging open war on the People's Committees. Who was at the side of the US military government in Korea? It was the same reactionary forces that had served Japan, the landlords, the former police officials, the military officers, the bureaucrats. And on the surface, the US celebrated itself as a decolonizing force in Asia. And I'm not exaggerating there, they used that word. In reality, the United States actually subsumed an existing colonial structure into its own imperialism, after which after World War II became the dominant form across the world. So the two sides of Korea therefore embarked on two very different trajectories after 1945. In the North, the People's Committees continued as the democratic basis of a new government and a new social order built from the ground up by the masses of Korean people through the leadership of the Workers' Party of Korea. And this was not just achieved through the party, but through mass organizations that existed in all spheres of life and participated in the implementation of important democratic reforms, which occurred within a single year. Some examples include a massive land reform that transferred over 2 million acres to 700,000 peasant families, the first gender equality laws in Korea's history, more advanced, I would argue, than what exists in South Korea or the United States today, a mass literacy program, the nationalization of all industry, and the first democratic local elections in Korea's history. In the South, meanwhile, the old collaborators clung to power, and the free market ideology introduced by the occupying Americans actually gave the landlords and police even more free rein to exploit the people than under colonialism by Japan. Just over a year after the US occupation of Korea began, in the fall of 1946, the Southern Peninsula exploded in rebellion as the remaining people's committees, trade unions, and farmers' associations rose up against their oppressors with the support of communists in the South. By 1948, 3 years into the occupation, a guerrilla war had begun in the South. The cause of the guerrilla war was the attempts by the US to hold a UN-monitored election in Southern Korea. Now, we might think of the UN as only a positive force in the world, but we have to understand that the US wanted a UN-sponsored election because only in Southern Korea, because this was the only way to ensure that communists would not lead an eventually independent Korea. And they knew that they could achieve this through the UN because at the time, the Soviets were boycotting the UN due to politics concerning China. Now, when the time to vote came, peasants were forced to the polls under threat of losing their rations because the military had been providing them with rations after their free market ideology wrecked the price of rice and introduced the possibility of mass starvation. And even extreme right-wing forces in South Korea boycotted this election because it was universally understood that what these elections would do would not be to create an independent Korea, but to create a divided Korea. So the guerrilla war that began started in the large island of Jeju, which is off Korea's southern coast. Then the nearby cities of Yeosu and Suncheon on the peninsula were the site of a mutiny of Korean soldiers who refused to repress that rebellion in Jeju. Throughout 1948 and 1949, peasant guerrillas fought bitterly against the illegitimate Republic of Korea that had been proclaimed. The new Republic of Korea, known to most people as South Korea, and the remaining US military retaliated with brutal violence. In Jeju alone, it's estimated that between 30,000 and 60,000 people were slaughtered before the official date that we are told the Korean War began. Many of the tactics deployed locally echoed America's genocidal past and presaged the counterinsurgent tactics that would be used in wars to come. One Korean observer noted that the American tradition of lynching had been introduced to Korea through the Jeju massacre. The other tactics that were used include the burning of entire villages, policies that identified civilians as enemy combatants, the indiscriminate use of torture and rape as weapons of war, the justification of mass violence in the name of anti-communism, and the use of local actors to perform the dirtiest deeds, which if you studied wars in Vietnam, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you will know that these are things that the US military continues to do. Now, this history is totally absent from the official account of the Korean War, which usually places the origins on solely June 25th, 1950, when the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel. But by that point, there was already a war that had been taking place in Korea for years. This war was really an extension of the prior war for national liberation that Koreans had fought as a people for decades. The two sides in this war were roughly the same as the sides that existed under colonialism. On one side, you had the masses of organized peasants and workers, many of them under communist leadership. And on the other side, you had the landlords, the capitalists, and other collaborators who had once served Japan, but were now allied with the United States. When the DPRK, or North Korea, marched south, its aims were to complete the struggle for national liberation that had begun decades before and was being artificially prolonged by the unnatural division of Korea and the occupation of the South by US forces. We should also note that the point of who actually started the fighting on June 25th, 1950 is disputed, and I would highly recommend the book that Noah plugged earlier, The Hidden History of the Korean War, to get a better investigation of that. The DPRK has always maintained that the South struck first, and the earliest records from the time actually indicate widespread confusion on all sides about how the fighting began, with some indications from the US Army itself that the South may have actually attacked first. There is little doubt that North Korea intended to march south, but they also only had about half of the divisions that they needed ready for battle when the war officially began on June 25th. Furthermore, there had been skirmishes along the 38th parallel initiated by either side for about a year already. We know now that the US was also likely aware that the Korean People's Army, the DPRK's forces, were amassing soldiers at the 38th parallel for months beforehand. Yet in all official communications from the United States in the summer of 1950, they stressed that this was a surprise attack. And that narrative of North Korean aggression was very instrumental in justifying the US's entry into the war. And by and large, that's the narrative that stuck. All these years later, it is worth asking what exactly the US had to gain from this war back then, and what it still has to gain from prolonging it today. To tackle that last question, I want to take us on a slight detour. As the lead up to the Korean War was occurring, another showdown was also simmering in Washington, the start of McCarthyism. McCarthyism is usually thought of in the United States as only a domestic issue, but it actually had origins in events in Asia. Senator McCarthy's charge of communist infiltration in the government began after the triumph of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. The halls of the Capitol shook with the question, who lost China? McCarthy had the answer. It was the communists and queers, in his language, in the State Department. So what was arguably America's most famous Red Scare was also a moment of yellow peril and lavender scare. The picture starts to become more complete when we consider that McCarthy was among the most influential contacts of a woman named Sung Mei-ling, who is also known as Madam Chiang Kai-shek, wife of the leader of the Republic of China, or the Nationalist Forces of China. China was so important in the United States in 1950 because for more than a century, the US had been benefiting enormously from China's semi-colonial status. China provided workers that built US railroads and agriculture. It was an enormous export market for many of the United States' earliest industries, going all the way back to the fur trade, to grain in the 19th century, the development of agriculture in what we now call the Midwest. So it's not an exaggeration to say that the fate of the US has always been entwined with the fate of China. China going communist was disastrous from the perspective of the United States because it meant that China could no longer be freely exploited. So with China lost, preserving Taiwan as a foothold of US influence in Asia was absolutely critical to many of the leading imperialists of the day, including General Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of UN forces in the first half of the Korean War, from 1950 to about 1952, I believe. The Korean War provided an opportunity to corral forces in Washington to back the defeated Republic of China, which by then was only limited to Taiwan, where it remains to this day. During the war, MacArthur especially also attempted to extend the conflict at various points into a general war against the Soviet Union and China. These included air raids into Soviet and Chinese territory, as well as plans to eventually deploy Chiang Kai-shek's soldiers in Korea. All the while, MacArthur was cheered on by Senator McCarthy and his allies in Washington. Another aspect of US motivations in Korea had to do with rebuilding Japan. The US kept its war headquarters and all the warplanes it used against Korea and Japan throughout the entirety of the war. Japan was able to rebuild its economy by providing essential goods and services to the US military. This was the explicit policy in Washington at the time. It was a crucial goal of Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who had a theory of establishing a Great Crescent that would flow from the Persian Gulf into East Asia, with allies in Iran and Japan in particular as the anchors of that. At the same time, the Korean War also had a global economic effect. Noah really importantly and astutely identified some of this when he spoke earlier about its role in establishing price controls and also in influencing the politics behind wages. The end of World War II, however, had also caused a slump in worldwide demand. The Korean War reinvigorated that demand and drove the reindustrialization of former Axis powers, not only Japan, but also West Germany. Domestically, it also revived the military-industrial complex initially built in World War II. Defense spending quadrupled in the first few months in the first half of 1950 and remained at that level pretty much ever since. Many of the wartime factories that otherwise may have closed in the US were saved. Korea was also the first so-called police action where the US entered a war without consulting Congress. We may not think about that today, but that is supposed to be unconstitutional, but the fact of the matter is that that's just how the US has conducted its wars ever since. So in many ways, the Korean War birthed the United States as we know it today. Now, if all of this does sound eerily familiar, that's because US interests in Korea remain pretty much the same. The massive joint war games in Korea that now take place on pretty much a monthly basis, if we're being honest, are a huge driver of increasing Pentagon budgets year after year and securing new lucrative contracts for companies like Raytheon and Boeing year after year. More than 70 years later, Korea is still a primary field for the US to escalate against China. Washington still wants to obliterate any anti-hegemonic project anywhere in the world. China and the DPRK are two clear examples of this, and especially important not only because of their socialist orientation, but because they now threaten US military supremacy in the most lucrative region for capitalism in the entire world, which is Asia. At the start of the Korean War, communists and a minority of progressive people in the United States raised the call for peace and the defense of Korea. And that's once against our task today as those of us living in the belly of the beast. But we need to raise a much more rigorous and all-encompassing struggle than what could be managed in the 50s. We are living through an age of ecological and social collapse, where the choices facing humanity are between our collective destruction or our collective survival. Peace is the most basic precondition for the path of survival. Thank you so much to all of you listening and watching for taking that first step to inform yourselves. And I hope you'll continue on this journey with us, because what's at stake here is not only Korea's future, but really the possibility of a livable future for all of us. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much for that great historical perspective and for your work in Nodutdol. I think your guys' work has been incredibly important for developing this organizing. Up next, Sheen Kim is a co-chair of the Youth Leadership Committee of DSA's International Committee and a member of the YDSA's National Coordinating Committee. Sheen also organizes with Women Cross DMZ as a Korea Peace Now campus chapter coordinator. On campus, she was vice chair of the Student Worker Collective at Dartmouth, one of the first undergraduate labor unions in the US. Sheen will talk on the extent of US destruction, Korean casualties, and the ongoing impacts of the war. You can go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sheen. Just really honored to kind of be here with all the folks doing really important work on kind of what it means to really forge out what is a reunified and sovereign Korea. Everyone here, amazing. And a big thanks to Ju-Hyun for giving this really wonderful, comprehensive background to this conflict. I'm just going to dive kind of deeper into the minute history of the war and kind of the scale of impacts actually that the war itself, so kind of that vague period from 1947 to, the present. As we know, war is not just kind of neatly bracketed off. The scale of death and destruction that has just entailed. The Korean War was a massively violent war. It was the crucible of kind of US imperialism and brutal modern warfare as we know it. This contradiction of both capital and the kind of actually like the very overt fleshy bloodiness of the war that it calls and depends upon. And the destruction that the US carried out throughout the war was very deliberately sadistic and went into the extent that Jejuans and other survivors have, called it a genocide. And this violence took form in a myriad of ways. The most obvious form is these direct US atrocities on humans committed throughout the actual hot duration of the war. Ju-Hyun kind of forecasted this with, massacres, these burnings, these rapes, these procedures of military procedures that allowed it. But there was also the US destruction of Korean infrastructure, specifically in North Korea, that led to millions of post-war deaths. And not just the US itself, but also US violence, quote unquote, through the auspices of both the ROK, its colony, and its funding of paramilitary violence. A lot of my work here kind of depends on the work that actually South Korea, for example, South Korea Truth and Reconciliation Committees and the Jeju 4-3 committees have been doing alongside historians like Bruce Cummings and Jeremy Kuzmarov, who are also great historians on this work alongside Stone. And to just start us off, I'll throw a bunch of numbers at you. So the Korean Hot War, which we know is June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953, resulted broadly in the deaths of 5 million, as Gerard said, people, and which consisted of 3 to 4 million Koreans. It produced 6 to 7 million refugees and destroyed over 9,000 factories, 5,000 schools, 1,000 hospitals, and 600,000 homes. The deaths were 10% of the entire population, which isn't to name the millions that have been displaced, injured, permanently separated from their families, and has reverberated kind of throughout the ages. The DPRK's figures actually say this could be up to 12 or 15% of the total population. And in terms of sheer kind of military might, the US Air Force launched something between 600,000 to 700,000 tons of bombs over Korea from air bases and naval aircraft over North Korea, and bombed what were 75% of food sources in the DPRK at the time. I'm a bit averse to counts when it comes to this stuff because we know that mass death is mass death, but the fact is that this is a kind of this extremely violent struggle that has reverberated to actually billions of people. And among other things, Ju-Hyun mentioned, the Korean War was called a limited war because it averted nuclear weapons and was defended as this police action. And these are we need to kind of destabilize some of the common military terms that tend to really obscure just the brutality of the US's violence. There's legal condemnations that can be made, for example, myriad Geneva Convention violations, for example, bans on indiscriminate citizen attacks. But we know that also like this, and many of us are socialists who know that life and destruction is beyond kind of legal code and legal recognition. And so Rhee and the kind of the history that Jeong mentioned created this ripe condition for U.S. violence, from revolts to South Jeollado in 1946, riots in Daegu, the deaths of thousands of civilians, mass arrests, martial law. And I'm starting us a little bit from the war, right before the start of the actual war in 1950, start quote unquote with the Jeju massacre, which we briefly touched on, which was from 1948 to 1949. And again, it was a series of rebellions that started around Jejuin's refusals of the division of the peninsula in the 1948 elections that simply cut Koreans in the North out of the equation. And to quote, the 9th Regiment on Jeju Island at the time adopted a program of mass slaughter among civilians in the hill villages, avowedly on the premises that all of the people were furnishing aid and comfort to guerrilla troops. Or as Everett Dumright of the American Embassy called it, it was an all-out guerrilla extermination campaign, which in practice became an all-out extermination campaign of Korean civilians on the island. And again, it was this year of kind of brutal violence that authorized the killing of 30,000 to 60,000 Jejuans, backed by the Rhee administration, and actually primarily carried out by the Northwest Youth League, which was a fascist reactionary paramilitary supported by Rhee and actually created of the same South Korean landowners that were kind of dispossessed by the People's Republics. And throughout this, Jeju kind of marks the start of what is this combination of US allowing of mass slaughter. And also, if you look at military reports from the actual time, you see perception by the US military that these are just accidents. So for example, a delayed report reports these things. Oh, this was used in the performance of these executions. But we did not have a part in this, or the Northwest League had a part in this. And so incidents became to the US military, to the US, simply accidents that were witnessed. And so the US kind of straddled this line of kind of blame and blamelessness. And that is kind of where we're foregrounding the rest of the destruction that is to come. So the outset of the war, which I guess 1950, it was marked by this general kind of callous violence and allowing of US brutalities against the Koreans. So the rules of engagement during the war allowed for the killing of quote unquote all enemy combatants in all its vagaries, which thus kind of sanctioned to the US military the mass air bombings, napalming, chemical warfare, destruction of civilian Korean cities, and specifically North Korean population centers. And as MacArthur said, quote, "We burned down every town in North Korea and some in South Korea too." The Korea War became kind of the laboratory of this techno war, where we have not just the confluence of anti-communist and sentiment, the lavender scale, the yellow peril, but also of a very distinct technological development. You have 3.5-inch rocket launchers, you have super bazookas, you have all these fancy new toys that the military is using to kill Koreans. And as I mentioned before, just kidding. So the US Air Force launched over again 600,000, 700,000 bombs compared to 500,000 tons during the entire Pacific theater in World War II. US soldiers were ordered to hit anything that moved. 18 out of 22 cities were obliterated in North Korea, including 75% of Pyongyang and the entirety of Sinuiju. And kind of what you see from interviews during this time of military heads is that there's this kind of consistent sentiment of, quote, "Look, let us go down there and burn down 5 of the biggest towns in North Korea, and that ought to stop it." And this was said by General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command during the Korean War. And throughout the war, alongside kind of just these massive numbers, are these atrocities, which are not kind of exceptional events, but just examples of natural examples of what results from this entire regime of death surrounding the war. So in 1948, you have this mass killing of women and children, the Kochangin massacre by Republic of Korea soldiers. Kim Jong-un kills 500 women and children at a kindergarten and is actually later pardoned by Rhee. Republic of Korean soldiers consistently participate in what are called quote unquote commie raids. And so what I'm doing now is essentially the war is marked by just a series of mass atrocities In Shimon, 719 villages are accused of aiding communists and simply killed in what is, quote, part of, quote unquote, Operation Rat Killer by General James Van Fleet. The Republic of Korea army stripped down towns of their food stocks, raped North Korean women, shot prisoners, burned prisoners alive, kept prisoners in very decrepit conditions, shackled near death as what some people describe as skeletons. The US 34th Infantry drove civilians out with white phosphorus, cut them to pieces with high explosives, killed hundreds of civilians with very little accountability. Some of the worst atrocities kind of occurred in the summer of 1950 when Republic of Korea units emptied the prisons and shot detainees. They dumped the bodies into these trenches. And actually, if you look, there's pictures of the bodies kind of just layered on top of each other. One of the biggest massacres was the Daejeon massacre, where as the North Korean People's Army kind of bore down, to quote Cummings, upon the city of Daejeon, south of Seoul in July of 1950, South Korean police simply removed political prisoners from local jails. So that included all kinds of civilians, soldiers, simply massacred them, threw them into open pits, leading to the deaths of 4,000 to 7,000 Koreans. American officers idly stood by and actually photographed these. And these are some of the more viewed photos of the Korean War today, of the atrocities by South Korea hand in hand with the US, which, can be attributed again back to the US as a whole. And there's so many kind of accounts of these numerous atrocities. So there's revenge killings, mutilating women, the dropping of gas bombs by American B-29 bombers on Nampo City. There is at Nogunri, and you have the wholesale firing on of civilians who are simply trying to pass through a tunnel. You have the bombing of bridges so that civilians cannot pass. And on top of this, you have kind of what is a very twisted kind of experimentation with warfare. So in 1951, you actually have the US Joint Chief of Staff issue these secret orders for quote unquote large scale field tests for biological weaponry. And a 1952 Chinese report actually corroborates that US spread smallpox, diphtheria, among other diseases throughout the area. And US bombers also attacked the actual infrastructure of cities and of civilians. So 3 irrigation dams in Toksan, Chasan, Kuonga, and attacked more to, quote, unleash flooding and to disrupt the rice supply. And I also want to just kind of take a pause here and say, I'm kind of saying like Korean civilians and soldiers, but that is to say like civilian or not, Koreans are dead in this case. And what you have here kind of at the outset of the war is you have millions dead, you have kind of massively destroyed infrastructure, massively destroyed cities, Koreans who have actually just been wholesale separated at the border with very little contact to families, very little communication, because again, why would the US Army talk to the people that they are trying to kill? And just this outset of brutality and chaos that consistently defines the war. And I could kind of go on and on about like, oh, there was this atrocity here, there's this incident here, but I do think we get the point at this point. And I'll read this quote with, I'll end this kind of like section with this quote from a military report from the Guncheon massacre on September 24th, 1950, where the army reports, "We fired 6,000 rounds mixing Willie Peter and high explosive. The firepower knocked out 2 enemy tanks and killed 300 gooks." And so there is this mix again of this racialized violence, this mass desensitization, Koreans as kind of this playground of what is a US war. And there's also then the deep trauma that exists from not just the happening of these violences, but the erasure of them in the past and kind of moving through them, the chaos that simply people continue to reckon with as the war continues in ways. The 2005 Truth Commission, 2005 South Korean Truth Commission first investigated the war, said that there was indeed atrocities, and made some recommendations and kind of concluded with this policy of, a policy memorialization, organizing events, establishing historical records and monuments, furthering quote unquote peace education, creating follow-up laws and whatnot. And it's a kind of document that rings hollow when you see how hand in hand just the US and the Republic of Korea together have been in furthering allowing these atrocities. And of course, just a testament to how brutal the US has been, not just in Korea, but in Afghanistan, and in also funding continued wars now that even as it doesn't have its direct hands in it, it continues to support. So, for example, see the war in Russia and Ukraine. And I'll conclude this section just by bringing us back to 1948, to the Jeju Islanders who continue to grapple with this violence at the very outset of the war from 1948. And the Jeju Islanders called for, quote, "If you oppress us, we will resist. We oppose the single line," referring to the vote, "and we call for the reunification and liberation of the motherland." And so we learned that destruction is not simply this immediate event, but an actually insidious kind of continuing event, both a racialized and ultimately a class struggle. The violence was incited by the US. The violence was technologized, designed, blueprinted, done by the US, and executed by not just US soldiers, but South Koreans who allied with the US regime and collaborators who allied with the US regime. And anti-imperialism is kind of this struggle of ghosts, is what one of my comrades referred to it as, ghosts still living in futures that are very spectral. And what we have here is actually a war that has left countless numbers of ghosts that I think every Korean kind of carries with us. This division, people who are still today divided from their families, given little assistance beyond military means, and which just simply hammers home that we carry these ghosts with us, but of course the future is also a ghost that we create out, and it's our duty to kind of ardently oppose war and imperialism anywhere, knowing just the impact and the loss that it causes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shin, for that in-depth overview. It's always been incredibly striking to me how little this history is taught in the US of the true genocidal scale of death and destruction and war crimes the US carried out in Korea in this war. Okay, next panelist, Jeong-eun Hwang has been involved for more than 10 years in the Korean social movement. She is the General Secretary of the International Strategy Center, an organization based in South Korea of Koreans, foreigners, and immigrants who study international issues and organize solidarity activities. She is also the head of the International Solidarity Committee of the Justice Party, a progressive political party in South Korea, which currently has 6 elected representatives in the National Assembly. She will discuss the contemporary political situation in the South and the organizing that is happening. And you can take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Hwang Jeong-eun, and thank you for organizing and participating in this wonderful and meaningful event. I prepare PPT slides. Let me share the slides first. I think everyone can see. First of all, I'm very pleased to be invited to this event and have a chance to present. And today I'm going to present on contemporary political situation and anti-war organizing in South Korea. May 10th marked the 1-year anniversary of Yoon Suk-yeol's government. The Yoon administration has made regression in all areas, including politics, diplomacy, society, and economy. From the government's irresponsible response to the Itaewon tragedy last year, to tax cut for the rich, and even privatization of the public sector, the list of regression seems endless. However, today I'm going to focus on 2 major issues regarding political situation. like a microphone outside. I hope it's not that. Just interrupt. The two major issues are deepening crisis on the Korean Peninsula and labor repression. Under the intensified US-led new Cold War amid the Ukraine war last year and escalating the US-China tension, the Yoon administration is seeking to strengthen South Korea's relations with the US and Japan, and even pursuing trilateral military cooperations. Such a movement was manifested when the trilateral defense ministers meeting among South Korea, the US, and Japan was held in Singapore in June last year. During the meeting, the three countries publicly disclosed and institutionalized missile warning exercises, ballistic missile detection and tracking exercises, and agreed to expand military cooperations among them in response to provocation from North Korea. In effect, they charted a course towards NATO-level military interoperability between the three countries. Afterwards, in November last year, the leaders of three countries met in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and decided to further consolidate their cooperation not only in security, but also in the economic sphere. During the summit, they openly and explicitly stated that the trilateral cooperation aimed to contain China. Prior to the summit, President Yoon also announced South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy, which actively embraces the US strategy aimed at strengthening its presence in the Indo-Pacific region. This clearly indicated South Korea's firm position in aligning with the US. This year, Yoon Suk-yeol government held a summit with Japan in March and a summit with the US in April. During the South Korea and Japan summit, they officially formalized a solution to the issue of forced labor. However, this solution failed to contain a formal apology or even acknowledgement by the Japanese government and compensation by the responsible Japanese companies. And in fact, the historical issue was brushed aside to normalize bilateral relations. The decision made by the US government was welcomed by the US, and South Korea and US summit established a nuclear consultative group and increased deterrence in response to North Korea's nuclear weapon program. This involved the regular deployment of strategic assets, including nuclear armed submarine, to the Korean Peninsula, heightening tensions rather than pursuing dialogue. It didn't stop there. In May, during this G7 summit, the trilateral summit concluded in just 2 minutes. The meeting aimed to deepen cooperation, including real-time sharing of North Korean missile alert information, strengthening trilateral coordination on the Indo-Pacific strategy, economic security, and engagement in the Pacific Island nations. They also committed to holding another trilateral meeting around July. The strengthening of the South Korea-US and South Korea-Japan relations has resulted in deterioration of inter-Korean relations and an intensification of confrontation. Look back at the history of the inter-Korean relations since 2000, it is evident that a strategy of confrontation based on the logic of power rather than dialogue has never been a solution for resolving inter-Korean issues. Briefly looking back at the history, since 2000, there has been progress in inter-Korean relations during the Kim Dae-jung administration with the June 15 Joint Declaration and Nomuyan administration with the October 4th Declaration, which promoted dialogue and exchanges between South and North Korea. However, following the sinking of the Cheonan, the Lee Myung-bak administration implemented the May 24 measures suspending all inter-Korean exchanges except for the Kaesong industrial complex, leading to a renewed rupture in inter-Korean relations. But the following Park Geun-hye administration continued this trend by closing the Kaesong industrial complex, citing North Korea's nuclear test as a justification. There was a brief resumption of dialogue between North Korea and the US, as well as inter-Korean dialogue, but it fell short of achieving a peace agreement. And current administration maintained a consistent policy of hostility. In particular, the Yoon administration resumed large-scale joint military exercises with the US that had been suspended since 2017. By strengthening deterrence and conducting nuclear war exercises, as well as deploying US strategic assets capable of carrying nuclear weapons, this approach only served to further drive North Korea's nuclear development. There is a lack of visible effort to promote peace. Relying solely on deterrence is insufficient to guarantee peace, and the idea of achieving peace based on overwhelming force is not feasible and will only lead to an escalation of armed competition. Moreover, the military strategy of the South Korea-US alliance is expanding beyond the Korean Peninsula according to US interests. There is a growing possibility of the involvement of US forces stationed in South Korea. Plan to enhance aligning with the US military strategy to build a comprehensive counterforce against China, in which the South Korean military can be mobilized or participate. This poses a problem as the Yoon administration intensifies regional tensions by mentioning support for Ukraine with weapons or siding with the US on Taiwan-related issues. While intensifying the crisis on the Korean Peninsula through its foreign policy, the Yoon administration is also increasing repression against the workers and social movement domestically who are making critical voices against the Yoon administration. There were a lot of cases, but I'd like to introduce two examples today. Last July, subcontracted workers at Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering went on strike, demanding wage increase and better working conditions. The government did not take a stance to understand the issues and resolve this conflict. Instead, the government ordered a strict response to what they deemed as illegal actions. Even after 51-day strike ended and negotiations between labor and management concluded, the government stated that they would respond to any illegal activities that occurred during the legal occupation in accordance with the law and principles. Subsequently, Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering, backed by the government stance, filed 47 billion won in compensation for damages from the workers after the strike ended. The second case involves the strike by freight workers. The freight rate system, which was designed to guarantee fair wages for truck drivers and reduce risk, was scheduled to expire last year. The freight workers union went on strike to demand the continuation and expansion of this system. In response, the Yoon administration invoked an unprecedented work resumption order, even criticized by the ILO. Additionally, President Yoon made remarks expressing hatred towards union, stating that the freight workers' strike was equivalent to the threat from North Korea's nuclear weapon. With harsh repression and threat to workers, the strike finished and the system was expired by the end of 2022. Such labor repression ultimately leads to the death of workers, in addition to the ongoing death of workers in workplaces where safety regulations are not upheld for sake of corporate profit. The recent death of Yang Hwang, who sacrificed himself in protest against repression of constructions worker, is a tragic example. The Yoon administration, based on a pro-business and anti-labor stance that simply views efforts to ensure workers' lives and safety as costs, does not stop there, but continues to repress civil societies. With President Yoon openly mentioning the possibility of misusing government subsidies by civil organizations, audits and reductions in support targeting civil societies are being carried out extensively. In the face of Yoon administration, which pushes Korea Peninsula into a war crisis and represses labor movement and civil society, the social movement sector in Korea is exposing the regression and repression of the Yoon administration. We're gathering voices calling for judgment of the Yoon administration and taking actions against it. Especially the struggle against the Yoon administration in relations to escalating the war crisis continue. Especially, I would like to share some cases about anti-base movement in Korea. First, let's examine the anti-base movement in mid-2000s as the US military base expanded in Pyeongtaek. They sought to expand the bases and try to evict the residents of Daechuri village located next to the base. In response, many peace activists, human rights activists, and artists joined forces and start struggling together. Even though there was a fierce 2-year struggle, Daechuri village disappeared, making way for the world's largest US military base abroad. But the residents preserved the history and records of their struggle by creating a historical museum. They also established the Pyeongtaek Peace Center to continue peace movement related to the military base. Another one happened in 2000. There was also an anti-naval base movement in Gangjang village, Jeju Island. The South Korean government decided to construct a naval base in Gangjang village without proper consultation with the residents, sparking the struggle. The Navy forcefully proceeded with the construction, even with the fierce struggle of the residents and activists nationwide. In 2016, the naval base was completed. After that, the residents and peace activists didn't stop. They have continued their activities by monitoring the naval base and focusing on various social issues and peace-related matters in Jeju Island. The struggle seems to be endless regarding this military base or military-related facilities. In 2016, the decision was made to deploy the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense called THAAD, or Defense Against North Korean Missiles, and Sosangri was designated as the site. Experts expressed concern that THAAD, rather than being suitable for defense against North Korean missile, served as a means for the US to exert pressure on China and Russia, thus escalating military tensions in Northeast Asia. Despite opposition from the experts, the residents, and peace activists, the government proceeded with the deployment of THAAD in 2017. Currently, the Yoon administration has announced the plan to normalize the THAAD base this year. In response, the residents and peace organizations have declared that they will continue their struggle until the withdrawal of THAAD. This year marked the 70th anniversary of the Armistice Agreement, and the demand for peace treaty has always been present in order to achieve lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. However, the current actions of the Yoon administrations are moving in an opposite direction. More than 700 organizations in Korea and abroad formed a peace section to stand against that, and are conducting campaigns for peace treaty. The peace action is carrying out the Korean peace appeal. You can find on the DSA link. You can also sign on the campaign petitions. And we're trying to have a 1 million signature calling for opposition to war on Korean Peninsula. Also, there is a demand to cease the joint military exercise and no to trilateral military cooperation. And the campaign also involves peace actions in 300 locations worldwide and organizes a rally on July 22nd in Korea. Lastly, the International Strategy Center is also preparing for solidarity events to join this domestic and international effort for peace. In August, we are going to organize an international forum to seek peaceful solution opposing the new Cold War that threatens the Korean Peninsula, East Asia, and the world. This international forum is in continuation of the previous one in last December, informing people of the new Cold War and to oppose it. Currently, the Korean Peninsula, the old Cold War was never resolved. Peace was never achieved in Korean Peninsula. Instead, we have had an Armistice Agreement. In that regard, when you talk about new Cold War brewing, many would not be surprised. After all, South Korea has always had military tensions with North Korea and influenced by the US interests. The work of the ISC is to introduce a new framework to peace and security in the Korean Peninsula. This framework is that of the new US-led Cold War, primarily against China's rise to maintain its hegemony. For the purpose, we try to provide analysis as well as create exchange and collaboration with organizations in Korea and abroad. We're going to share more details when they're ready online through the network we have. I would like to wrap up my presentation by emphasizing that the people's struggle have never stopped under any circumstances like Japanese colonial repression, military dictatorship, and it continues today. And I believe in everyone here participating and discussing carry on this struggle. And I hope we can exchanging and acting in solidarity to realize peace and put an end to a Korean War. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that great presentation and for all your important organizing work in the ISC in South Korea. I encourage everyone to check out their work online, including the recording for the recent peace conference they organized. Okay, for our last presentation, Cathi Choi is the Director of Policy and Organizing for Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of activists mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure feminist leadership in peace building. She coordinates the Korea Peace Now grassroots network launched in 2019 to organize communities in calling for demilitarization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Her writing is published in the Journal of Policy History and the Asian Pacific American Law Journal. And Cathi will talk on ending the Korean War and US military occupation and sanctions. You can go ahead.
Thanks. So please let me know if my share screen is not working. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the host for having me. My name is Cathi Choi. I'm the Policy and Organizing Director at Women Cross DMZ and the co-coordinator for Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network. So I want to also thank all the speakers for all the education and energy that you all just so generously shared. While I'll be talking about my organization's work, I want to acknowledge that we are just one part of this very large and vibrant, and as Jeong-eun shared, old ecosystem that has been fighting for an end to this war for decades. We're all part of this collective struggle. So as you all know, we, especially those who are based in the United States, we have a critical role to play in organizing for peace in Korea. Most Americans don't realize that the Korean War never ended, nor do most Americans appreciate that the Korean War is the longest running US war. The irony being, of course, that the US is the main driver of continued war making on the peninsula, past and present. The Korean War inaugurated the US military-industrial complex, as so succinctly described by Ju-Hyun, quadrupled US defense spending, set the US on the course to become the world's military police. Today, the US has 30,000 troops in Korea, the third highest installation of military bases of US military bases worldwide, including the largest military base overseas, Camp Humphreys in Pyeongtaek, as just described by many of the speakers. Just last week, the US nuclear-powered submarine pictured here arrived in Busan, South Korea, capable of carrying 150 long-range missiles. So Grace Lee Boggs asked us to consider the question, what time is it on the clock of the world? Well, as many of the speakers have discussed, it's the 70th anniversary of the Armistice, which is the ceasefire that was meant to temporarily halt, but was never meant to be a permanent place in the Korean Peninsula. Just last month, US South Korean military troops held the largest ever joint military drill in Pocheon, which is 15 miles from the DMZ, pictured here. Here you can see images of US and South Korean forces conducting combined joint live fire exercises. You can see the destruction of the natural landscape, the hyper-militarization that is ongoing. And this is the first of its kind in 6 years and took place to mark the 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance. UCLA Law also recently hosted a symposium about the US-ROK alliance in honor of the 70th anniversary, describing the, quote, American security posture. So this is a critically important year to organize, to change the narrative, and to fight back. I'll be talking a little bit later in this presentation, but this year we are organizing hundreds of individuals to turn out for Korea Peace in Washington, DC, alongside dozens of national co-conveners and co-sponsors. We have a 3-day program with a mass rally and march, and I encourage you all to join or to lend your support in whatever way that you are capable of doing so. While organizing, we also have to understand that the ongoing war manifests in ways that are perhaps less easily sensationalized than the images that I just shared, but deadly and heartbreaking nonetheless. The first manifestation being sanctions. The DPRK is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world and has been subject to a combination of unilateral sanctions by the United States government for nearly 20 years, as well as sanctions imposed by the United Nations. The purported purpose of many of these sanctions are to pressure North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, and they act as a near total ban on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. And given the dominance of the US dollar in global finance, sanctions have cut off the DPRK from being able to participate in the international economy. Sanctions have widespread effect on everyday North Korean people, and while I'll be sharing resources at the end of the presentation to learn more, I'll just share briefly 2 manifestations of specifically a gendered impact. First, in maternal health care. North Korea's nationalized healthcare system has led to many developments in maternal health care, for example, an 8-month maternity leave and improved antenatal care. However, these developments can only go so far when sanctions cut off essential forms of medical provisions. For example, the overwhelming majority of women in North Korea do not have access to emergency reproductive kits like oxytocin to treat postpartum hemorrhage or magnesium sulfate to treat preeclampsia. Sanctions also directly interfere with North Korean women's abilities to be autonomous and make a living for themselves because they target sectors in which women are heavily represented, such as textiles, where women make up nearly 90% of the workers. Another effect of this ongoing war is the travel ban. The travel ban to the DPRK that we have in effect today began in 2017 after the detention of Otto Warmbier. Despite the long history of US citizens traveling to and living in North Korea without incident, the State Department has totally restricted travel while stating that it is for the safety of US citizens. This ban to North Korea is stricter than any other in that it prohibits any entry of a US citizen whatsoever other than for a few limited exceptions. These are for certain journalists, humanitarian aid, or those traveling in national interest. However, even with these stated exceptions, the State Department exercises basically unfettered discretion in terms of approval and timing. And it's important to remember, and I think a lot of people don't understand or don't appreciate that prior to this travel ban, hundreds of US citizens traveled to or lived in the DPRK annually. From 2000 to 2017 alone, an estimated 6,000 Korean Americans traveled to North Korea to reunite with their loved ones, from whom they became separated during the war. Now, since the passage of the travel ban, only 20 or so US citizens have been permitted to enter the DPRK per year. So here I'd like to highlight the work of so many individuals who are chipping away at this travel ban, including members of the Live campaign, who have been organizing public education and grassroots efforts. And I believe Ju-Hyun has shared or will be sharing the link to the postcard campaign or the ways that you can sign up. And you can also reach out to me for that information. Activists at Women Cross DMZ and Korea Peace Now have been fighting for change on multiple fronts. In 2015, Women Cross DMZ organized a delegation of 30 international women peacemakers to cross the DMZ from North to South Korea to call for an end to this ongoing war. A few years later, Women Cross DMZ joined forces with 4 other women's peace organizations based in South Korea to lead the campaign, which is now called Korea Peace Now. I also want to note we inherit a long history of organizing. We do not have to reinvent the wheel. We inherit a long history of both diasporic Koreans and international coalitions organizing for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Elders and those who have came before show us that internationalism is absolutely an essential thread in progressive movement building. Here we see on the left a group of international women who organized to visit the Korean Peninsula during the war, as US military forces were engaged in air bombing, leveling entire cities in the north, and President Truman announced that he was considering using the atomic bomb. Park Chung-hye, the chair of the Korean Democratic Women's Union, and Korean feminist activist Ho Chung-suk asked the Women's International Democratic Federation to send representatives. This group of 21 women arrived in the Korean Peninsula in 1951 and wrote a report to the UN in which they raised alarms about the devastation of the Korean War and publicized the atrocities. On the right, you'll see a flyer for Diamond Kim, who is a Korean independence activist organizing from Los Angeles for Korean independence from Japanese colonial rule, and later on for Korean freedom from US military occupation. I want to thank Ju-Hyun for mentioning earlier the ties between McCarthyism and the Yellow Scare. Diamond Kim was one of the individuals who fought against McCarthyist communist hunting and took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. These are just two examples of the many that show how important it is for international actors, diasporic Koreans or Kyopoder, to use their voice in their relative positions of power while working in concert with activists on the Korean Peninsula. So what organizing tools do we have at our disposal? Well, as I mentioned, we can learn from our elders and all those who have organized before us. Korea Peace Now specifically focuses on grassroots organizing and legislative advocacy efforts. For Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, this is formed out of this realization that the United States poses the main obstacle to peace. Activists formed this US-based grassroots network to form a broad coalition across all sorts of lines in order to organize for change in US policy. Together, our grassroots network now encompasses over a dozen chapters with hundreds of members across the nation. I see a few leaders on this call, including Shin, who just spoke, and this is actually them right here giving an amazing anti-Yoon speech in Boston at a rally, and I love their sweater. We also engage in legislative advocacy efforts, and in these efforts, we organize around the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. We've used this tool to translate grassroots energy into building political will, and we've seen major gains over the years. Over 10 years ago, when this bill was first introduced, the first of its kind calling for a peace agreement in Korea, we could only get 2 members of Congress to support. Now we have over 30 co-sponsors in the most recent introduction, and every year we organize Advocacy Week, through which we rally constituents to meet with their congressional representatives to lobby them to co-sponsor the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. As a result of our latest advocacy efforts, we've gained 5 new co-sponsors just in the past few weeks. We use this bill as a tool not only to harness people power to force the issue with their congressional representatives, but also as a platform to educate many of these congressional offices, many of whom do not know basic things about the Korean War. Further, as Miriam Kaba, the abolitionist organizer, says so beautifully, storytelling is a fight for our future. We also seek in this grassroots network to change the narrative through cultural organizing and political education, drawing through lines between this movement and other transnational movements that intersect with ours. Here you can see Diane Bourget-Lin's Crossings poster. This film, this documentary, shows the 2015 DMZ crossing that I referenced earlier, and is having its world premiere this July 23rd to coincide with the 70th anniversary. We're organizing screenings across this country and hoping that this film can spark mass dialogue and change and discourse around Korea. If you'd like to host one of these screenings, I'll also be sharing resources for that at the end. Additionally, our grassroots members engage in community political education. You can see some examples here at the bottom. Tony Cho from UCSC presented to our Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network national meeting on environmental justice and military bases. Yoon Ra, filmmaker about Red Canary Song. You can watch their film Fly in Power at films festivals all across the United States. They presented recently on intergenerational cultural organizing with their own grandfather, who's themselves a cultural worker based in Ansan, South Korea. And also Joseph Han, another Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network leader and author of Nuclear Family, who recently wrote a beautiful, moving testimony about the impact of the Korean War on Hawaii in a collaborative post with Kyopo. Also at the policy level, we've released multiple educational reports on sanctions, US-China relations, the peace agreement, and we've seen these direct benefits. As a result of our sanctions report, the former UN Special Rapporteur for the DPRK, Tomas Ojea Quintana, came out in support of our movement and called for a peace agreement in Korea. So as you can see, we've been making strides. I know we've heard some really difficult, and as we should know, history about the extent of destruction and violence and just bloody warfare on the Korean Peninsula. And as I've also mentioned, the sanctions and the travel ban, and I know it can feel disheartening, but people power, with that, we can make a lot of change, and we have made a lot of change. So I invite you to join us, join all of these organizations on the call, follow all of our work. As I mentioned, this July, on the 70th anniversary of the armistice, we're mobilizing hundreds for direct action. I think a few people of the panelists will also even be joining us. On July 27th, we'll have a congressional press briefing, a rally in front of the White House, a march, and a vigil at the memorial. We'll also, on July 28th, have a full day conference with activists, strategists, writers, a panel on the human costs of this unended war, as well as the stakes of what it means to denuclearize the peninsula with nuclear scientists, experts, and military experts. So you can read more about our action at the website here, koreapeaceaction.org, and you can also join our movement, koreapeacenow.org. And please stay in touch and reach out with any questions. Here's my email. And as promised, here's some sources and resources for folks to follow up. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Cathi, for that great presentation and for all your work. And thank you everyone that joined us and all our panelists. Before we close, we're going to share some action items and resources, and we'll have some closing remarks if any of the guest speakers want to have any final remarks. You can find all the information from today's event at dsaic.org/Korea, which we will update with the recording after, as well as all of these upcoming events and actions and resources, which we really urge everyone here to check out and to get involved and share with others. We had over 125 people on this call and a lot more that RSVP'd. So if everyone does even one of our very simple asks, just share, contact your representative and just ask them to support this important new legislation. That would make a difference in the long run. So, and I also encourage, everyone to consider joining us at DSA. If you're a member, join us in the International Committee to help us continue this organizing. We're all volunteers doing this work, so we always appreciate anyone interested to get involved and help out. And I'll put these links in the chat for everyone. And yeah, I'm going to hand it over to each of our guests. If anyone has any closing remarks or plugs that you want to give out for people to get involved, or re-up any of the upcoming events or news and actions and resources you want to share. And maybe Ju-Hyun, you want to go first, since Nodutdol is doing a fundraiser right now that you want to maybe talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. So this August, we are sending a delegation to South Korea, where we will be meeting with progressive organizations, with trade unions, with peace activists. We'll be visiting many of the sites that Jeong-eun highlighted in their presentation about sites of struggle against U.S. military bases, including Soseongri and Pyeongtaek and others. This is a really important trip for our organization, not only because it is an opportunity to build person-to-person connections in Korea, worker-to-worker relations in Korea, but also because it is the first delegation that we are undertaking since 2017. Nodutdol as an organization was founded in 1999 because of this program known as the Korea Exposure and Education Program, which began prior to that in the 1990s. And for a period of about 20 years, sent annual trips, actually, of diaspora Koreans to both South Korea and North Korea. It's a very rich and important part of our history. It is part of how the foundations, I would say, for the Korea peace movement as it exists in the United States today were built. And we are hoping to revive that tradition, through this trip. So there is a link in the next steps that Gerard will be sharing to donate to this. One other thing I would like to highlight is that our trips to the DPRK, our delegation trips to the DPRK, have been paused because of a travel ban that was implemented during the Trump administration, preventing US passport holders from entering the DPRK. This travel ban has been maintained every single year by the Biden administration. And I say every single year because they have to renew it every year. So it's not one of those cases where, you know, it just kind of bureaucratically floats along, but there is an intentional decision to renew this travel ban. We have written an open letter to the Biden administration demanding that this travel ban be lifted. We are also undertaking a postcard campaign, which you can participate in digitally in order to express your support for lifting this travel ban. I want to highlight what's really crucial about this, in that we have not discussed so much the internal society and politics of the DPRK on this webinar, but I think that I'm not going to stretch anyone's credulity when I say that the simple fact is that most people in the US and most people in South Korea, for that matter, just do not know anything at all about anything that is going on in North Korea, because you don't have the opportunity to visit. And for South Koreans, that's because it's actually illegal and you will be prosecuted. So that's another aspect of why these trips are so important, because we are among the only Korean people in the world who were able to do this. And, you know, it has ramifications beyond just communities of Koreans in the United States. It impacts our entire nation because we do share a common destiny and future. So I think, you know, that is why it is really crucial for us to revive these trips, really crucial for us to lift the travel ban. And I would really urge everyone watching to, you know, take those steps, make those donations, submit a postcard. If you're part of an organization, you can endorse the open letter to Secretary Blinken of the State Department. And on a final note, there were a couple of questions that were raised about, you know, the role of the labor movement, and also questions about the people's committees. And I want to kind of try to address these very quickly by saying that I think the people's committees offer us historical instruction in that the practice of politics can actually be done on a mass basis. We can have mass popular organizations that implement politics on their own. We don't have to limit politics to going to the voting booth. That's actually an incredibly narrow and very limiting understanding of democracy. And something about the US political situation is that we don't have those kinds of popular mass organizations. There's no vehicle for us to exercise our political will. We always need to ask someone else. And the labor movement's resurgence is really important because it allows us to start building those organizations once again. And it's incredibly crucial for any form of that these organizations take, whether they're labor unions, tenants unions, students associations, what have you, that they don't limit themselves only to thinking about the immediate needs of their constituency, but have a broad political vision for what the future should hold, what society should be like, and are willing to fight for it. Because we need unions by our side in this struggle. We need all kinds of organizations involved in this. It's not just that, like, you have to belong to an explicitly anti-war or Korean organization and only those people get to have a say. No, we need everyone to come on board, and we need agitation within the ranks of all of these types of organizations to ensure that their leadership understands their political responsibilities and implements them accordingly. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to have any final say or any plugs? You know, Noah, you have a new season coming out soon.
Yeah, August 25th, our 4th season comes out. It's about Afghanistan. Stay tuned.
Can I just make the quick plug summation? So for those who are interested in coming to DC, the website will be Shared Korea Peace Action. That's July 26th through the 28th, the anniversary being the 27th. For those who can't make it, still want to organize, we have a whole host of options. As I said, we are organizing screenings of that film Crossings. We also have monthly meetings for Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network, and encourage you to join our next one, which is going to be, it's the 2nd Thursday of every month. And so please just join and learn about our national efforts. We also have regional chapters, so reach out to me if you're interested in a regional chapter. As so many have said, it's about this moment and it's about the 70th anniversary, and it's also about seeding things we won't even see the full fruition of in our lifetimes. So join an organization, join your community, organize with tandem with others, and I'm excited to see you out there, all of you out there.
Okay, I would like to say thank you again for everybody, and it's really like great to see you all even online, and I hope you made the delegation from Nodutdol this year in Korea in person. I'm looking forward to it, and if there's any like events or like this kind of webinar, I would like to join again, and I also hope everyone who joined this discussions and participating in this event can come to the ISC August International Forum to find peace and solution for this. So thank you everyone, and hope you have a good night.
Yeah, I'll hop in here real quick. Thank you so much to the International Committee and just the work that they consistently do, especially this is alongside the Asia Oceania Subcommittee, which consistently does really amazing solidarity work. So thank you all. And thanks everyone to coming and to my comrades on this panel.